Welcome to the Actual Fluency podcast. Each week you'll find inspirational, motivational interviews with some of the world's best language learners, industry experts, all trying to help you to learn foreign languages better, faster, and more efficiently. And here we go. If you're looking for a language teacher to enhance your language learning, then I highly recommend iTaki. iTaki is the world's biggest tutoring platform, and you can find thousands of teachers and tutors at very reasonable prices. Get a free lesson after completing your first lesson by going to languageteacher.co. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Actual Fluency podcast. Before we get into today's episode, which is a really exciting one about the quest for your heritage, in today's episode, Jonty Yamisha comes on the show and talks about his experiences learning the language of his ancestors, the Circassian language, which I hadn't heard about before this recording, and I think it's quite exciting to hear about other different kind of languages and peoples around the world. And I don't know how many of you guys listening out there are actually learning a language for heritage reasons, because I know that is a big reason. Let's say your grandmother's from Germany or your parents migrated from Italy or wherever your heritage comes from, there's a language there that could be useful to either discovering more about your past or talking to relatives as well in their original language, or partners even. You know, you can learn the heritage language of your partner as well. So that's an interesting story for today. Just before I let you loose on the story of the day in this episode, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Polyglot Cruise. If you're listening to this episode on August 9th, when the episode first went live, then you can still register for the first cruise, but you have to be quick. The registration ends August 15th. So if you want to join me and 30 other people on the first ever cruise, April 2020, then you have to go quick to Polyglot Cruise and register. There's still a few days left. If you're listening to this in the future, then do check out polyglotcruise.com for future cruises, because it's definitely something that I want to do again and with different itineraries. So we're already debating where Polyglot Cruise number 2 is going to take place, but I'm thinking somewhere in North America. What do you guys think? Let me know and enjoy this episode, and be sure to sign up to the cruise if you haven't already.
I have most often introduced myself as a third-generation refugee. And what I mean by that is, or the flip side of that is, I am the first person in at least 3 generations to be born, grow up, be a citizen of, and speak the language fluently of his country of birth, right? So what does that mean? I was born in the United States. Clearly, I speak English fluently. I'm a U.S. citizen because I was born here. For all intents and purposes, I feel comfortable here. There's nobody who could come and forcibly remove me, and it's highly unlikely that there would be some violent unrest in the United States that might displace me anytime soon. You go backwards in time, my mom and my dad were both born in the Golan Heights of Syria, right? In fact, my mom was born in what is now technically part of Israel. So a whole slew of Circassians settled in the Golan Heights of the Middle East. Today I have some relatives who are on the Israeli side. I have some relatives who are on the Syrian side. So my mom and dad were born in a region that was not their ethnic homeland, speaking Circassian, not Arabic, having learned Arabic, speaking Arabic as effectively as foreigners, even though they are living in that land, and then came to the United States in the late 1960s, early 1970s to build a new home. So they came here as refugees because of war. You go one generation before them, I'll just stick with my dad's side of the family because it's just a little bit easier. My grandfather was also born in that region, except that when he was born there, it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Wow,
and
yeah.
so what he spoke, in as much as Arabic was the government language of my father, Turkish was the government language of my grandfather, right? And the reality is that whole region is very, very ethnically diverse. So my dad growing up He spoke a little bit of Turkish, a little bit of Hebrew, a lot of Arabic, some Circassian. Um, that's about it. My grandfather spoke those same languages, but Turkish was probably a little bit stronger than my dad's. Because of religion, Arabic was still pretty strong, but they spoke a different dialect of Arabic than the local Arabs did. Then I go to my great grandfather. My great grandfather was born in a region that was not part of the Russian Empire when he was born there, but had become a part of the Russian Empire during the course of his life. And so it was probably, I can't imagine any monolinguals in my family for a long time, other than me.
Right.
Or, well, I'll get to me in a minute. I can't imagine any monolinguals in my family for a very long period of time, because even if I go back to my great grandfather, who was born in what is now part of the Russian Federation, at the time of his birth, he would have spoken Circassian, but because there are so many other different ethnic groups within the Caucasus, I mean, the Caucasus is probably, if I had to guess, the size of a large U.S. state. It might be a third the size of Texas, so a large state, but not a huge state. But it has more languages spoken there than the entire European Union. Dagestan alone probably has about a dozen or 15 languages spoken within it, right? So,
right. So
growing up,
just to get people along, Circassian is an ethnic group, and did they have a region, a territory that was then kind of taken on by all these like wars and power struggles and empires building and changing, or was it kind of a spread out?
So, so I'm an ethnic Circassian. Circassians are organized around roughly 12 tribes, 12 principalities. Each tribe has its own dialect. Some of those dialects are as close as two dialects of Arabic or two dialects of Spanish. Some of them are as far as Portuguese to Romanian, right? So that's kind of how far. And it really depends on where geographically your tribe was from. If you're geographically close, your dialects were close. If you're geographically far, your dialects were far.
Got it.
So the Circassians are the largest ethnic group historically and today, the largest ethnic group in the Caucasus. The Caucasus is this wondrous, amazing part of the world where Europe and Asia kind of all intersect. There's a North Caucasus and there's a South Caucasus. The North Caucasus are north of the Caucasus mountain range, and they are all part of the Russian Federation. The South Caucasus have historically never really, they've been in the sphere of influence of the Russian Empire, but not necessarily part of Russia. And so South Caucasian states would include countries like Georgia, it would include countries like Armenia, and depending on whether you believe it's a country or not, I believe it's a country since I am a citizen of it, but Abkhazia. So that would be the South Caucasus. The North Caucasus would include the semi-autonomous republics of the Russian Federation, which would include republics such as Dagestan, Ossetia, Chechnya, Ingushetia, and then the three titular Circassian republics, which are Kabardino-Balkaria, Qarasheva-Cherkessia, and then Adygea. So that's kind of where we're from, where I'm from ethnically. As is the case with human history, as stronger and larger and more powerful peoples expand, they create empires. Russia was not the only empire. It's not going to be the last empire either. Human beings, want to go out and conquer. But as the Russian Empire expanded, it incorporated parts of what we called Free Circassia into the Russian Empire. And so, that's kind of the little bit of back history there. And then in terms of geography, if you're looking on a map or you're trying to reference where this is, the Caspian Sea is the eastern frontier of the Caucasus. The Black Sea is the western frontier of the Caucasus. And then the specific region where I am from, where most of my family is from, is Kabardino-Balkaria, or Kabardino-Balkaria, I guess in English. The capital of that is Nalchik. Kabardino-Balkaria is just north of the state of Georgia, and probably about an 8-hour drive east of Sochi, which is where the Winter Olympics were held a few years ago. Sochi was the capital of our country before it was incorporated into the Russian Empire.
Wow.
My grandmother was Abaza, and I have many cousins who are Abaza. And as a result of that, a few years ago, I traveled to Abkhazia to visit them, and I secured my citizenship there as well. So now when I travel, I can travel to Abkhazia I can own property, open a bank account, and I can travel to Russia without a visa because I hold that passport.
Wow, very nice. And going back to yourself, I don't know if you want to continue the story. I just wanted to know about when did you get interested in this and find out about this? Was that something that came early on in your life, or did you kind of rediscover that as an adult and had to go back and ask your parents about what was that about? What was that about?
So it's I've as I'm 40. I turned 42 this year. I've got 4 children in total, 2 for my first marriage, 2 for my second, and I've always been very open and supportive of exploring our identity, our ethnicity, our religion, our culture, our history with them. I was almost shocked as a kid that my father was so terse about and my mother were so terse about our identity. And I'm not denigrating them. I think it's just part of the generation and the culture that they grew out of. And when I would ask them about what their parents would say, they were even more terse. And I don't know whether this is something to do with the austerity of our culture or whether it's something to do with this feeling of loss of being expelled, having so many people die in war, then being forcibly removed from your region. But as a kid growing up, I can't say I was confused, but I can't say that I was clear on who I was. I was a Circassian, originally living in Southern California, where I was born, then moving to New Jersey, where the bulk of my family in the United States lives. I was this, Circassian kid whose parents came from Syria, who was living in Southern California, who was a practicing Muslim, and all that kind of made sense to me. It's funny. I think I have 2 small kids. I have 2 toddlers and 2 teenagers. To the teenagers, I think it kind of makes sense to them. I mean, I've explained it a little bit better, but for my little kids, it's just completely normal for them that we speak a couple languages at home and kids at daycare speak different languages. And so growing up as a kid, there weren't really any questions. That was just my reality and I accepted it.
Yeah,
But as time went on, my parents wanted me to speak English so I wouldn't have an accent. So I could, and obviously we know today in modern linguistics that doesn't, that's not very likely that you're going to form an accent living in a country where a language is spoken. But they were concerned that I wouldn't speak English properly. They were concerned I might be discriminated against. I think also, frankly, they were eager to practice and improve some of their English. So Circassian was always around me in the way that perhaps you know, an Anglo-American in Los Angeles hears Spanish in the background. So it was always there in the background. Arabic was always there in the background. Little bits of Turkish and Russian and perhaps Hebrew every now and again were always in the background. But to say that I could put 2 or 3 words together would be very charitable to me, right? So what would happen was every couple of years when I was small, we would go back to Syria to visit relatives, which is where the bulk of my dad's family still resided. And when we'd go there, I would hear Arabic and I would hear Circassian, almost no English. And of course, my Arabic sucked and my Circassian wasn't that much better. I might be able to put 3 or 4 words together while I was there in either of those languages to just roughly communicate. Um, and as a result of that, I never really had the opportunity to connect to my personal history, my family, my culture, my grandparents, right? So as time went on and I became a teenager, I think it was always there in the background as almost like a picture of a old relative who might have passed away. It's kind of like, oh, there's a picture. I know what that picture is, but because I know what the picture is, I don't need to know who the person was, right? But as I became a teenager, and I think this is part of human nature, we start to ask ourselves, who are we? Where do we come from? And here in the United States, there was my dad and 2 brothers. That's the extent of the Circassian of the. My last name is Yamisha. That was the extent of the Yamisha men that I could look to. And my father had 1 sister, um, and that's just different. I didn't have any guys in the family. And I'm not trying to be sexist or anything, but I think women look to women for role models and men look to men for role models. So
sure.
I saw my dad and I saw 2 younger brothers, and I thought, well, that's not enough for me to make a pattern. Are my family typically artists? Are they scam artists? Are they politicians? Are they merchants? I don't know. So as I became a teenager, I think I became very interested in trying to reconnect with that part of my identity. So I went to high school, and in typical American high school fashion, American high schools are not known for producing quality foreign language speakers.
Did you pick a foreign language there?
So I picked a foreign language, and I picked German. And like many people that I've met in my life, I went through 4 years of German, and I could barely speak it at the end of my 4 years. It really, I'll fast forward a little bit now. So I studied German because there were lots of Circassians in Germany, and I thought, well, maybe I can go there someday and speak to at least some of my ethnic kin. And then sophomore year, my second year of the 4 years of high school in America, I also added French to my repertoire, just because I can't say that I learned German through my German classes, but I can say I got excellent grades. And I think it's because I do have an aptitude for foreign languages, but I also believe, like many others do, that the way that languages are taught in many, many institutions is very lacking.
Oh
So I
yeah.
got great grades, but I didn't speak very well. It really wasn't until I went to college that I realized how poorly I did speak German, where I went into an intermediate, the second class after the beginner class, and I just completely fell apart. And that was after, an entire um, 4 years studying it in high school. And what I really did was I threw away my textbooks. I stopped paying attention in class, and I just kind of did my own thing, and everything just kind of clicked. And that was the beginnings of realizing that I was not bad at learning languages. I just had bad teachers, or not bad teachers, bad methods. I think the teachers really tried their best, but they were kind of forced to use these methods. So what happened there was, as I picked up German, I thought, wow, this is an interesting way to learn a language. I've gone from almost nothing to being able to communicate and say almost anything I want to say, at least at the time. My German's very rusty now, but I can still have a conversation if I want to in German. I've covered all this ground. Could I do this for Circassian, right? Is it possible to do this for Circassian?
On this podcast, I've interviewed hundreds of language learners, some of the world's greatest polyglots and industry experts. And one thing they all agree on is the value of one-to-one tutoring lessons. And for this, I highly recommend iTaki. They have thousands of teachers in all price ranges, and they even have certified teachers who have taken diplomas or have degrees in the language you're learning. So whether you're just brushing up on your Italian ahead of a trip to Rome, or you want to master Russian to take the exam, or whatever your goals are in languages, iTalki has a tutor suitable for you. And compared to private tutoring offline, it's really affordable. You can find informal tutors down to $5 an hour, and you can have trial lessons for even less. So if you want to master a language from the comfort of your own home, and you even get a $10 credit when you complete your first lesson, go to languageteacher.co and check out iTalki. It might be the best thing you do for your language learning this year.
This is over 20 years ago. I was 18 or 19 years 18 or 19 years old at the time. This is what really began my trial and error process of figuring out how to learn a language. And the reason for this was I wanted to learn Circassian.
Yeah.
The problem is, other than materials that I have produced over the last 10 years, there are almost no high quality materials that are designed for someone who speaks none of the language to learn the language.
Right.
What I mean by that is there are some books over in the North Caucasus in Russia that are available, but they assume that you read and write Cyrillic. They assume that you already speak it in the household to your parents, and so your starting point and your perspective are fundamentally different than somebody coming into it from scratch.
Yeah.
Right. So I can honestly tell you, over the last 20 years, I've tried. What I did was I tried every commercial method I could get my hands on, right? So I bought Rosetta Stone, I did Pimsleur, I played around with Duolingo, obviously much more recently, Living Language, whatever else, Asimil, I've done all those things. My kind of not really my aunt, but kind of my aunt. She was, her father was the first prime minister of Jordan. And so she always had a lot of relationships at the UN. She worked at the UN International School. And so she finagled, she pulled some strings, got me in there for a few classes to kind of see how they teach children multiple languages and how they teach diplomats multiple languages. Figured out what the FSI was, and started kind of gobbling up their materials. Went over to the Resias Institute at Dartmouth, and actually before he passed away was taught in a kind of extended weekend class by John Resias, who developed the rapid teaching programs that were used by the Peace Corps. You know, you got to learn Swahili. You've got 2 weeks till you go to Africa. We're going to cram as much as we can into your brain. So even took ESL classes speaking English to see how they would teach.
Wow.
So whether it was a book, a program, a book, a lecture series, a computer program, an in-person program, a rapid weekend teaching thing, an extended online thing, personal tutoring, you name it, I tried it. And I tried it for Arabic because I was already a little bit knowledgeable in Arabic, and I wanted to see if that method of teaching would differ. I wanted to see how different methods would differ depending on whether the language was close or far to English, Germanic, Romantic, Semantic, Asiatic, whether it used a Latin alphabet or no alphabet like some Asian, like Mandarin does. There's no alphabet, it's a character set. I wanted to see whether people focused on audio methods, reading methods, visual methods, acting methods. Kind of went through all this stuff, and I realized there is no rhyme or reason. There is no consistency in any of these things.
That's amazing.
In any of them. And the other thing, around this time, this is probably, I'm now fast forwarding up to 5 years ago, I was fascinated by this kind of misplaced but still semi-true, at least in my view, opinion, that if you know X number of words, you can communicate. And it's funny because I saw something on Reddit just this morning. Why are people so obsessed with this? I think people are obsessed with this because you can kind of quantify it, right? I can go download a list of 1,500, 2,500, 5, and I can try to memorize them. And then it's the only real easily quantifiable method for you to measure your effort, not necessarily your output, but your input, right? So it is tempting, it is tantalizing. And I said, well, let me do this. I will start translating these words. I developed this huge network of volunteers who would translate words into Circassian for me. So I said, let me start translating these words. And I learned, I have a nonprofit organization. I've got 2 linguists who are on my board. One is John Colarusso, the other is Daniel Kaufman. John is a Harvard grad who teaches at McGill in Canada. Daniel teaches at CUNY and Columbia in New York City. And they joke that I've probably got a postdoc in applied linguistics at this point. But started looking at, everything from sight words for little children to, in the United States, California achievement tests, looking at Ogden's basic English vocabulary lists, Voice of America, basic standard vocabulary lists, word frequency vocabulary lists. And, there are probably out there a half a dozen, quote unquote, word pools, right? They might be high frequency, they might be useful words, they might be this. And I actually typed them all up and did some Excel magic, and I realized there's very little overlap there. Right. So let me give you an example. I went out and bought a Routledge word frequency dictionary in English, and because of the statistical nature of how those word frequency dictionaries are compiled, in the version that I had, 3 of the 12 months are not on the list.
What?
So yeah, 3 of the 12 months are not on the list. So if you're looking at a word frequency list as a means of a basic vocabulary set, because of statistical quirks, it's not going to do it.
That's really funny, actually. I wonder which months are not.
I don't remember offhand, but I just, and then the other weird thing is I started looking at different vocabulary sets for different languages, all from Routledge. And I'm not, Routledge is I use them not to denigrate them, but because they are a well-known, well-trusted, reliable source. What I came to realize there was, in almost every course or program or book or whatever that I'd ever studied, the word help was probably one of the first 20 words, maybe 50 words that they would teach you. Can you help me? I'm
Yeah.
lost, right? In almost every language that I looked at, the word help was like word number 500.
Right.
So that's when I also realized there's a difference between helpful words, no pun intended, helpful / useful words, and words that are frequently used. Because if you're learning a new language, there is going to be an overlap between the words that you want to learn and high frequency words. Clearly, you want to communicate with other individuals, but there are probably words that you want to learn that are useful and helpful that are not necessarily high frequency. Just off the top of my head, the word help. Another off the top of my head, the word ticket, right? Because if you're learning a foreign language, presumably you're going to travel there. And so airport terminology, which is not highest in frequency, but could be highest in helpfulness,
Mm.
would be something. And then the last thing is, as I started looking at all these auxiliary lists that were developed for children to learn, they had lots of numbers, and the reality is if you're just learning a language, yes, you need to know all the numbers, but you don't need to know them in your first 500 words, right?
No.
So what I had done over the years is, so at the end of all this, looking at children's kind of sight words, looking at high frequency lists, I had compiled a list of words that I wanted to know in my everyday life, speaking to my mother and my father, who were, are still alive, still are Circassian speakers, to my current wife, who's a native Circassian speaker, and raising our children here in Chicago, where there are virtually no ethnic Circassians, and among the half dozen who are here, very few of them speak Circassian.
Mm.
Teaching them, speaking to them every day, I compiled a list of about 5,000 words that, every time something came up in conversation, I didn't know how to say something, and I asked my wife, what does this mean? What's that word? And she might know it, or she might say, we use a Russian loan word for that. So I'd look it up in a dictionary, and I, from the ground up, compiled my own list of just shy of about 5,000 words. And then, just for shits and giggles, part of my French, what I then did, again, this is over many, many years, kind of combine all of these auxiliary word lists ranging from like Ogden's Basic English to Voice of America's basic vocabulary list, sight words, California Achievement Test vocabulary sets, not SAT because that's a little bit more advanced, word frequency dictionaries, commercially and freely available. And then finally, and this is really the part that took the longest, the Oxford CEFR up to B2, because I think above B2 you start to get a little esoteric in terms of vocabulary. Bringing all those vocabulary sets together, what I have compiled, and I'm almost done, but what I have compiled, what I am compiling is my master word list. It's probably going to be about 6,000 or 7,000 words when it's done. And I'm probably going to finish it up in a few more months. But that's the word list where I would personally feel satisfied that, if I had learned every word on that list, I could probably communicate as well as I would want in most of the languages that I speak or am learning or want to learn better.
Right. How do you combine that with, say, the grammar, or especially the Slavic languages have very difficult grammar, and the word list,
Yep.
the verbs, or no, actually every word on the list would be much more likely to be found in one case rather
Mm-hmm.
than the others. Did you account for that, or how do you plan on tackling that as you go through?
Yeah. So you're getting, for your listeners, right? You have a very informed listener group, right? So we all understand that the definition of a word is kind of spongy, right? Are you talking about a word? Are you talking about a lemma? Are you talking about the dictionary format? Are you talking about the fully conjugated? I mean, in some languages you can have up to 12 verb tenses, moods, cases, whatever combination of
Exactly.
those
Yeah.
variables you want to add. So when I'm talking about words, I'm talking about what we call in the United States head words, right?
Right.
So go is the head word, went is a permutation of go. And of course, that's simple from a statistical perspective. It's clean on paper, but the reality is you would never say, I goed last week to the store, right? So it falls for, it sounds good in theory, it falls short in practice.
Right.
So so how do I get around that? I started off saying, I'll just memorize words. And then I realized that doesn't really work, especially as I got into Russian, where there's verb aspect which, you know, you can have a perfect or an imperfect version of a verb, which is dictated by whether it's been completed or is an ongoing activity. And I realized things kind of fell apart there. So I moved, and then the other thing is, once you get beyond your first 1,000 words, you start moving into kind of abstract concepts. You know, when you're first learning a language, the word like case, right? Is it like in Russian, is it case like grammatical case, like a padej? Or is it like a case, like a matter, like, you know, dela, right? Is it something you're doing? Is it a court case? Is it a physical box that something goes into, right? So it first of all, as you get into these higher order words, they have multiple definitions, right? So now, you know, is the word run as a verb versus a noun one word or two, even though it's spelled the same, right? So I started to get into all this complexity, and this whole idea of memorizing words kind of fell apart on me. So what I started to do, I remember playing with Pimsleur and thinking, you know, this is not bad, but it feels like these dialogues were written after World War II. Like, I literally remember in Russian, there were dialogues like, Mrs. Pronin, is your husband at home? I have urgent business for him. The idea being that Mrs. Pronin has no value as a business person, right? And of course she's going to be home, right? All the secretaries are women. There's nothing like, you know, what are you doing later? It's like, may I invite you to a bar for some, you know, amazing business conversation. It's just, they feel very dated. And I've actually transcribed all of the German Pimsleur and all of the Russian Pimsleur just to see what they teach you. I actually have a blog post about this on my website, but they don't teach you a whole lot, you know, and for the amount of money they, you know, the lesson one or level, what they've added levels 4 and 5, but levels 1, 2, and 3, right, 30 lessons a piece. You're going to put in 15 hours if you just do it once. A lot of people do it more than once. You don't learn a lot, right?
No, because it doesn't include the silence.
No,
They don't
and
put
then
that on the description that
yeah,
it's 15 hours, but every single sentence they ask you to repeat it, which is like a 5 to 10 second silence.
yes.
So that really adds up. So it would be fun to trim the silence from Pimsleur and see how much is actually left, but it's not much. That's also
It's not much. It's not much. And then I stumbled across Glossica, and I think the folks at Glossica put together a very novel, very interesting thing. The idea is mass sentences, and you know, it was around this time that I'd finally stumbled across. So a lot of things were converging. I was moving away from vocabulary. I was moving towards sentence-based input. I believed that if I, you know, I remember one day my wife said something to me, and I thought to myself, I'm so stupid. I don't know how to say that. And then I thought, well, of course I don't know how to say that. I've never heard that before. This light bulb went off in my head. Like, I need to see, read, or hear something at least once before I would know how it's properly said definitively, right? Without just kind of intuitively figuring it out. But then I also figured out that with enough input, I would dynamically generate grammatically correct output. And this sounds strangely like Stephen Krashen because it is Stephen Krashen's theories, right? I didn't know it at the time. What I realized was, you know, I looked around at what my parents were able to do. My parents cannot read or write Circassian. They were never taught the language. I know for a fact they never stepped into a classroom where Circassian was a language of instruction. They were never told what the grammar was, and yet they speak it perfectly, better than English. And they've been living in the United States for, you know, 45 years now. And then I look at my 2 toddlers, you know, who are not capable yet of reading or writing, and they speak Circassian really well. I mean, the basic mistakes that kids make, I would argue they make fewer of them in what I would argue is my harder ethnic language, just because we speak so much. In fact, there's even certain times, like there's a lot of complexity in Circassian verbs. I'm not going to get into the details, but there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of prefixes and affixes. Circassian is a polysynthetic language. So as a result of that, our word structure can get really, really crazy. There are times where I'll actually see, I'll see my son. Like my son is like, the other day, I was like, what's up, Sarabdism? What are you doing over there? Says agora zizorasha. So, says agora, I, zagor something. Zizorasha is then the verb. It is semi-reflexive because a lot of verbs in Circassian have these prefixes that show who's doing it and who's receiving it. So I could see him right then and there experimenting in real time. Does this sound right? Does that sound right? And what he's really, zizo, zizay, ziza, it was, am I doing it? Is he doing it? Or are they doing it? And he's not consciously thinking, you know, zizo, zizay, ziza. He's saying what sounds normal in this context, and he got the right answer. So, you know, looking at, you know, lots of input gets you lots of output, but it has to be lots of input. That's when I realized, you know, something like Glossica is very interesting and very novel, but I actually bought Glossica, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to learn Russian this way. And a couple things that I realized. What, and with all due respect to Mr. Campbell, you know, he's got a great program that he's developed, but why are the sentences so strange? You know, Enzo comes from the north. You know, I play tennis every day, but not on Tuesdays. I'm not going to say this stuff in everyday life. You know, the other thing that I realized is I have 4 kids. I have a full-time job. I have limited time. 95% of my time learning a language is spent in my car during my commute. So what I did as part of this sort of 10-year odyssey to learn Circassian, and I'm still learning Circassian. I mean, I speak it well enough that there's almost nothing I can't say, but I just wish I spoke it, you know. And side note, what is the only correct answer to how many words you need to learn a language? More than you know today. It's, you always want to know more. So I want to speak better. Through, you know, I have a nonprofit foundation. I've produced lots of materials to learn Circassian. So I have all these kind of byproducts of learning language materials. During the course of my odyssey, I had purchased and I'd purchased, like, I think the top 3 phrase books for the top 5 most widely spoken languages. I just went to Amazon and I bought them. And then over the years, I had kind of, you know, taken all those phrases out of the books, sometimes electronically, more often than not manually typing, put them all into this master Excel database. And what was interesting was, regardless of whether it was Chinese or Arabic, German or Russian or Spanish, threw away the L2, just looked at the L1 so I could normalize. There was a remarkably small number of discrete phrases that I found. There was not more than 4,000 or 5,000 phrases altogether. And then what I realized is that a lot of these phrases are permutations. Hello, how's it going? What's up? How you doing? How are you? Right? Those are kind of 2 phrases, really. And then there were phrases that were too specific. You know, excuse me, sir, could you help me with my luggage? That's a long phrase that only has one use case, right? Excuse me is a nice short phrase. Can you help me as a nice short phrase. This is my luggage is a nice short phrase. And if you learn those 3, you can create a longer phrase. So went through all that data and arrived at just around 1,500 phrases that I really felt, as somebody who wanted to improve his Circassian, would cover every facet of life. And then what I started doing was recording myself saying them, because I would read them, right? Recorded myself saying them, and then started putting these kind of really ugly audio files together. And through trial and error, what I realized was phrases were good for me, and I think they're good for a lot of people, because, you know, if you're learning Duolingo, bears don't wear pants is not the most useful thing to learn, right? But if you want to be able to communicate with other human beings, I'm lost, that's too fast, this is good, right? These sort of super generic and super short phrases that can be mixed and matched and combined to say lots of different things. Those are very helpful. So what I realized was, you know, sentences were the way to go, because then you get vocabulary in context. But sentences had to be useful and meaningful. So here we go, you know, Stephen Krashen again. And then for a guy like me who was doing this on his commute, what I realized finally was the sentences had to be, roughly speaking, not more than 1.5 seconds long and not more than 5 syllables in length.
Right.
And the reason for that is that's where you have enough time in sort of a 3 or 5 second window of listen and repeat to store those sounds in your short-term memory and then retrieve them so you can speak them aloud and still remember the content, right? So you can repeat a series of syllables, you can understand context and meaning, but doing all that together, you know, that's what took time. So I figured, hey, you know, this is working pretty well. There's probably couple thousand ethnic Circassians around the world that follow my work, and they benefit from what I put together. But it's very time consuming and expensive to produce all this stuff, because there's not that many Circassians. I'm in the United States, they're in Russia, blah blah blah. So what I started to do was I worked with my wife to get all these things. Well, all these things were already translated into Russian, because there's not that many Circassians who speak English, but there's lots who speak Russian. So I would take everything in English, my wife would translate them into Russian, then we'd ship it to a linguist where we're from, who would then put it into Circassian. Around this time, I realized that in the UK, you guys have this Alexa, right? Amazon Alexa.
Yeah.
So the voice engine that sits behind Alexa is called Amazon Pali. And Amazon Pali is freely available to developers. Oh, I mean, they charge you, but the platform's available to developers. So what I discovered was I could take all these phrases that were in Russian, and I could dump them into Amazon Pali, and I could produce MP3 files that had all these phrases in them in my listen and repeat format. So what I originally ended up with was something where the English portion of like, hello, how are you, would be actually the Amazon Pali Russian voice, because they don't allow you to switch languages very easily. So it would be like, hello, how are you? Привет, как дела? Right? So it was so jarring. So eventually I hooked up with a developer. Who built for me a custom portal that I then was able to use to experiment and really very rapidly say, so here's 500 sentences, they're of varying lengths. Oh, okay, magic formula, 1.5 seconds long, less than 5 syllables, blah, blah, blah. I was able to throw all the stuff in there to figure out what the timing, what the cadence, what, the whole algorithm that I now use. And I experimented by teaching myself, or trying to teach myself, Russian using my methodology, my content, my platform, the whole 9 yards. And I spit out these, I would say they're probably the next generation of, if you were to take, what is Pimsleur, what could be Glossica in the future, and just put all those things that I just talked about and put them all together. They're using text-to-speech voices, which are imperfect, but for a learner, consistency that's imperfect is a lot better than inconsistency that is perfect, which is what you get when you have a native speaker. But then the other thing is the ability to just very rapidly and very quickly experiment. This became like my R&D facility. So for about a year, I experimented, with different lengths, different durations, different this, different that, to really come up with something that I thought made sense. I think my Russian sucks because I don't speak it at home with my wife, but because we speak Circassian in the home, but she is a native speaker of Russian, and every now and again we'll speak, and she would swear I sound like, somebody who's been studying Russian in university for 2 years and just hasn't had enough practice. So I know that my method works. I know that my content works. I know that, all this stuff works. And it is all self-funded out of my own pocket. What I've done is I've actually built a mobile app. I sent you an invite to one, and I know you're busy, so you probably haven't had a chance to look at it. But I actually built a mobile app where we take all this stuff and we kind of put it into one place. And in the beta version, which is just kind of friends and family, we have 20 languages, including Circassian, that are on the platform. Circassian is the only one with a human voice because there is no text-to-speech engine for Circassian. And the rest of them are all Amazon Web Services synthesized voices. So that's how I went from this guy who thought he sucked at learning languages and only spoke one to a guy who sucks less at multiple languages today.
Well, welcome to the club. I'm very experienced in that last part there. So yeah, it's fantastic and really unique as well. I mean, I don't think I've had many on the podcast who has had quite a journey like that. So do you want to just give the name where people can find out more about this app or your work if they want to be involved?
And I thank you for that. The name. So if you want to see my nonprofit work, that's where this all started. You can go to nasip.org. That's NASSIP, like Paul, nasip.org. That's where all my nonprofit work started, still exists. The website is a work in progress, but that's where I talk a little bit about the NASIP Foundation. It's an actual not-for-profit foundation registered recognized by the United States government as a nonprofit foundation that is designed to protect and promote Circassian culture, history, and language. So that's one place you can learn a little bit more about me. And then where all that nonprofit work kind of culminated into what I just described, which is kind of the commercial application of it, is Optilingo, and that's on the web at opti, O-P-T-I, lingo, lingo.com. And I'm not sure when the podcast is going to air. Right now, we have the old version of our site because we're not publicly promoting. We're in beta for the app, so we're not publicly promoting it yet. We only have 5 languages listed on the site. But in the next 2 weeks, I would say, maybe early to mid-August, we should have the new website up and running with all 20 languages on the platform and the mobile app available.
Very cool, very cool. One thing I want to know a little bit more about is how did you, for your kids, obviously you had the experience from your parents of, which is probably a usual. I mean, I've definitely heard that story before, where in a migrant family, the language, the heritage language, kind of gets forgotten, and it's the language of the country that is in focus, because, like you said, the parents believe that it would help the child to know the language of the country exclusively. But did you have a strategy or like a plan for your kids when you got them for your other languages like Circassian? Did you have a very specific strategy like that, or how?
No. The strategy is so blindingly simple that we don't call it a strategy. It's just the way we live. We speak to them exclusively in Circassian. And actually, I would say my best teacher of Circassian is not me. It's not even my wife. It's my 5-year. Oh, he'll be 5 in October. It's my 5-year-old son.
Right.
It's my 5-year-old son, because he'll spit out something really quickly, and while I'm trying to decipher it, he'll then run around the kitchen making a big mess. Or while I'm trying to get him to stop or do something or put on his clothing. And of course, little children require lots of repetition, right? So that's great for me, So for example, let me think, put on your clothes, right? This is not necessarily a high frequency set of words. I don't think this would be a very strange thing to see in a phrase book, right? I mean,
Facebook for parents, maybe.
or a phrase book to say to people you just met the night before. I don't know. So put on your clothes. Put on your clothes. We should right? So saying this like a million times to him every morning when he does not want to put on his clothes. Or to my daughter, who loves to take off her clothes, right? We should go to right? So saying that a million times, don't take off your clothes, don't take off your clothes. It builds in that repetition. So our real strategy was just to speak to them exclusively in Circassian. We do speak, my wife and I do speak occasionally to each other in English when there's like very complicated topics like estate planning or career stuff or medical stuff, right? The kitchen table talk of Circassian doesn't carry us that far, or it becomes very complex to talk about an MRI, or health insurance premiums, right?
Sure.
But we speak to them exclusively in Circassian, and they don't like to speak to us in English. It's funny because a lot of people who speak these heritage languages, especially Circassians, the children don't like to speak the heritage language. And a lot of my friends, they'll say, well, how are you able to convince your kids to speak it? And the dirty secret, I don't call anybody out on this, but the dirty secret is when parents say, we speak to our kids in that heritage language, they're not. They're not. Because I know it for a fact. If they really did celebrate the language, speak it with pride, and speak it exclusively, or at least more than 90% of the time to their children would prefer that language in the same way they prefer the L2 that is becoming dominant in that household.
Yeah.
So in our case, part of it was just always making sure that we spoke to them in that language, making sure that we speak predominantly to each other when we are around them in that language. But part of it also required us to invent words that just don't exist in the language, or loan words. Like, for example, and this is where it gets really convoluted. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the word for dishwasher is in Russian, but I know there's no native word for dishwasher in my language, in Circassian, right? So when we're talking about a dishwasher, we'll say hakshuk zatasha machina, right? Hakshuk, dishes, zatasha, the So that's a lot of things to put together, right? And
Yeah.
when you're speaking very quickly, it doesn't always make the most sense, but our kids understand it, and it allows us, as complicated and sometimes stressful as it is, it reminds us to avoid the temptation of using loan words, because it's a slippery slope. The moment you start using loan words, you then start using loan phrases, then you switch languages, and then your heritage language, or what you want to be your L1, starts to slip down, and your L2 becomes your L1.
Yeah. No, that's definitely a danger. But I think it's very good that you did it that way. And I think part of the strategy, if we were to call it that, is simply just to do it, because I think there's a massive natural resistance towards actually doing it, especially for, it's probably not as big a deal now, but it definitely was. Like all the people I've had on the show who talk about, last generation or the one before that going abroad, there definitely was a big pressure. Maybe there was a bit more intolerance to foreign cultures. I'm not sure about that, but there definitely seems to be, it's moving in the right direction, where instead of schools saying it's only English, 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 suddenly uh, languages are being recognized, and there's like it's become more interesting that way. So that's a really good progression to see. Are you adding any other languages to your kids? Any other ideas like Russian, for instance? You got
Yeah.
plans there?
So, yes, we are adding Russian. They both go to a daycare program that has a predominance of Russian speakers.
Oh, cool.
Um, a lot of the daycare teachers there are bilingual between Russian and English. The director is bilingual, and I want to say at least 40% of the kids are also bilingual in Russian as well. So they are picking up a lot of Russian. When we travel back to visit friends and family in our homeland, they'll pick up a lot of Russian, because kids there, frankly, they speak Circassian a little bit better than kids there do, just because of the decline of my ethnic language. And then just as a little joke, when we're in the household, when my son is feeling a little silly, or when he's being a little, misbehaving, pretending like he doesn't understand me, I'll just whip out to him like, "Ты говоришь по-русски? Немножко говоришь по-русски? Ты понимаешь?" So I'll just turn around and throw these little kind of phrases out at him, and he'll kind of look at me with this goofy grin, and he'll turn around and be like, "Я не понимаю по-русски, нет, нет," or "Я не голоден, я не голоден. I don't want to eat, I don't want to eat, I'm not hungry." So, he'll say these little things, but it's always just as a little bit of a joke, and then he switches right back into Circassian, because that's where he really feels comfortable.
Right. That's good. That's really good, and I hope that people listening definitely are inspired to do the same with their kids, whatever language that they might have from a heritage
It
background.
is draining, though. It is absolutely draining. It is no less draining than waking up at 6 a.m. every morning to exercise, to be in shape.
Mhm.
It is really, it's a commitment. It requires a lot of discipline. There were so many times, Chris, where because my command of Circassian has improved as my children have gotten older, for all the reasons that I just described. There were at least 2 or 3 times where I turned to my wife almost in tears, and I said, "Let's just give up, because I can't improve as quickly as these little guys are improving,
Right.
or I can't speak quickly enough to stop them from doing things that might be dangerous to them." But then that's when I would just kind of hunker down and just redouble my efforts. And honestly, I think that's another thing, being this unlikely guy who now has language courses that he's selling, and a lot of people do this, right? I'm not a guy who was a hobbyist. I don't think I'm um, atypical from a neurological perspective. I'm not a corporation that said, "Let's make money." I'm not a computer programmer who said, "Let me turn this into an algorithm." I was literally a guy who wanted to learn this language so he could speak with his grandparents, who are no longer with me, and then who started helping other ethnic Circassians who also wanted to learn the language, and then eventually got to the point where I want this language to survive, because it's a dying language. I wanted this language to survive so much that I wanted my kids to speak it, and I had to learn how to speak it quickly,
Yeah, yeah,
because my
yeah.
kids are not going to wait for me. When I was younger, I wanted to learn French. Well, maybe not this year, maybe next year. My kid gets one day older every day, and according to some research, picks up 20 or 30 new words a day. I've got to keep up with them.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I'm going to give up on this dream. So that's really
Jonty.
informed a lot of my efforts and my strategies.
And I can imagine that's why also that a lot of parents don't pass on their language to their kids. It's just because of the strain. It's so much easier just to stick to English in many cases. We
It
use
is.
English
It
as an
is. It's
example.
stressful. It's tough. And a lot of parents, they're focused as they should be. They're focused with putting food on the table. They don't have the luxury sometimes to partake in these kind of exotic languages, especially Circassian. I mean, as much as I love the language, the reality is it's not the language of a state. It's not the language of religion. You can't eat it. You can't buy it. You can't sell it. There's almost no media that's produced in this language. It has very little commercial value. And the reality is most people, their day to day is focused on their commercial viability. So
Yeah,
I
this is
don't
kind of
begrudge
why I
anybody
haven't heard
who's
about it
not
as
able to
well.
do it.
I'm sure for a lot of listeners, it will be their first they've ever heard of it as well. But that's also fun, to have some input and ideas from lesser known languages and cultures. I think that's a big part of the podcast as well, to give some insights. And I'm reminded of episode 148 as well, where I had Agev from Scotland on the podcast. He was talking about Scottish Gaelic and how he was passing that on to his kids, and how he realized that there was just nothing being done. It was all old people speaking
Yeah.
Gaelic in his region, and so he just started a project similar to yours, and the stories that you tell about your kids are actually exactly what I got from him as well. That he wanted his kids to speak that language first, and they'll always get English. That's the thing that I think sometimes parents don't realize is if you live in America or in the UK even, the kids are going to speak English.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a fact. That there's no way that they're not going to learn English if they're in that country, because the school system, the like the day to day, everything else, like you've got Hollywood and shows and everything. It's just impossible not to learn English, really.
Yeah.
So really learning the kind of the heritage language is way more important, and I think it's a great effort, and very commendable, because also, like you said, the kind of the commercial viability of it is definitely probably next to nothing, and so it's really a passion project, and yeah, it's a lot of work. I can imagine.
It's draining, but everyone needs a hobby.
Yeah, it's worth it when you see the results, and you probably connect with some of your people from all over the world because of it.
I feel like that's absolutely right. And for me, it was very, very heart, not word, even in English, I don't know how to explain it really. My whole life, I grew up and I saw my dad and I saw two younger brothers, and that was kind of it. And then every couple of years, we'd go to Syria and I would meet these other cousins that I couldn't really communicate with, and they're all younger than me. So, who am I? Where do we come from? All this stuff, just all these unanswered questions. Eventually, I learned Circassian well enough and I traveled widely enough that I was able to reunite my branch of the family tree with a branch of the family tree that is in Turkey, and then the original branch, which is still in Russia. And not only was I able to reconnect with those people, like find them, I was actually able to speak to them. That I can't, in any language, I cannot put into words what it feels like to look at a man your own age who has the same facial features as you, that you know for a fact is your relative because of family trees. And I've done genetic testing as well, so I know they're my relatives. But to be able to talk to those people in our ethnic language
Mm.
and hear the other side to so much more depth, the other side of the personal family mythologies around my grandparents and my great grandparents, and how and why this happened, and how and why that happened, it moved me to tears. And then to have them take me back to our ancestral village and show me, this is where this guy was born, that's where that guy's buried, there used to be a house here, you can still see the foundations. That I felt like a cultural orphan my whole life. And for me, it wasn't until I was able to unlock this language. I wasn't able to, until I acquired this language, I was not able to unlock all of this knowledge that my body, that my brain needed to consume to feel whole again. And, I think whether you are a multilingual person, bilingual, multilingual, or a polyglot, there's something in that story, in that experience that drives all of us, right? There's a reason that somebody chooses, somebody might be a white American who wants to learn Mandarin, right? Well, there's a reason they chose Mandarin as opposed to Swahili, or there's a reason they chose Swahili as opposed to Afrikaans, right? There's some connection that people crave, that learning the language they believe is going to help enable them. And anything that people like you, people like me, the Pimslers of the world, the Glossicas of the world, Duolingos of the world, anything that any of us or any of those apps or programs or whatever can do to help further that goal, that's all additive. It's all good stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I wish that there was a way for more people to kind of connect with their heritage and learn their heritage languages, because
Yeah.
before the call we talked about how nearly everyone wants to learn a language, but I think that desire is stronger with people who are in some generation immigrant, who's maybe the native languages, let's say for the US example, their native language is American, they don't know any other languages, but their parents' native language is different, just one generation back.
Yeah.
And you see that a lot. Or maybe they know a few words, but they don't, or they understand a little bit, but they really want to just speak it and use it, with their family members. And I hope that your kind of your little speech on on that can help inspire people to do something about that, because obviously nothing happens without effort, and learning a language is very time consuming and energy consuming, as you know. And but I still hope that people listening might be inspired to look up their heritage languages and give it a crack, because I'm sure there's going to be more materials on those languages than the Circassian like you overcame.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
That's exactly it. I mean, as long as there are speakers, then you'll be able to learn the language, right?
Yep.
Speakers or materials. But until then, just thank you so much for coming on and sharing your fascinating story. I really enjoyed it. I can't believe it that so much time has passed already. That's the drawback to interesting discussions. The time just flies.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for not telling me to shut up earlier on. I'm surprised that we've taken this much time as well. And like I said before, if you ever find yourself out in Chicago, you got a place to stay.
Fantastic. I'll make it. I'll make a trip out of it. And just for last time, did you just want to repeat why people can get in touch, and maybe they want your experience or tips on how they can learn their heritage language?
Sure. Yeah. So if you want to check out my nonprofit work or learn a little bit about the Circassian people or Circassian language, you can go to nasip.org. That is NASSIP, like Paul, nasip.org. If you're interested in the commercial application of my experiences or want to check out any of the 20 languages that we're trying to help people learn, you can check out our commercial website at optilingo.com. That's OPTILINGO, optilingo.com.
Fantastic. Definitely do that. And like you said, there was the beta test of an app. We're going to give that a look as well, and hopefully that will come out so everyone can enjoy the method that you experience. I think the kind of idea of using phrases is something that a lot of experienced polyglots, they'll go through a sort of revelation going from words to phrases. So I can't wait to see what you come up with there.
Cool. Well, I'll be eager to see to hear your feedback too.
If you're looking for a language teacher to enhance your language learning, then I highly recommend iTaki. iTaki is the world's biggest tutoring platform, and you can find thousands of teachers and tutors at very reasonable prices. Get a free lesson after completing your first lesson by going to languageteacher.co.